Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. Imagine a single gunshot in a faraway American forest starting a fire that would spread across the whole world. In 1754, a nervous young officer named George Washington signed a paper giving up. He barely understood what it said. By signing it, he started a chain of events that would reach 5 continents. This was the 7 Years' War, the first real world war. From the freezing plains of Saxony to the sugar islands of the Caribbean, from the jungles of India to the frontiers of North America, empires fought in a struggle that would change the map of the modern world. Kings fought for glory, merchants fought for wealth, and nations fought for survival. But behind the battles were stories of families forced from their homes, native nations caught between empires, and soldiers who marched into terrible battles, believing history itself was watching. This is not just the story of battles. It is the story of how the world was remade. The year was 1748, and across Europe there was silence. But it was not the silence of peace. It was the uneasy quiet of soldiers resting before another battle. The War of the Austrian Succession had just ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. But to many people, the treaty felt like pressing a pause button on an argument no one had truly settled. Maria Theresa had kept her right to the Habsburg throne, but it cost her dearly. And across the courts of Europe, anger burned beneath polite manners. This fragile calm stretched across oceans. In North America, Britain and France had carved their claims into the wilderness, drawing lines on maps that ignored the lives of native tribes who had been there for centuries. In India, 2 European trading companies, the French and the British, watched each other carefully as the once mighty Mughal Empire crumbled into a shadow of its former glory. West Africa saw forts and harbors turned into game pieces in a cruel game of trade and empire. Everywhere you looked, the world seemed ready to catch fire, but no one yet knew who would light the match. For the kingdoms of Europe, distrust was a way of life. Prussia, under Frederick II, who would soon be called the Great, had taken Silesia from Austria. It was a prize rich in mines and farmland, and Austria would not forgive its loss. France, though hurt by debt, was determined to claw back influence in Europe and the colonies. Britain, with its powerful navy, wanted to tighten its grip on trade and choke out its rivals. Alliances shifted like sand. Austria and France, once enemies, moved closer together, while Britain and Prussia, unlikely partners, began to see they had common goals. Diplomats smiled at banquets while plotting in whispers, each believing they could outsmart the other. But the truth was darker. Beneath the formalities of treaties and royal marriages, war had become almost certain. The world was shrinking. Oceans no longer separated continents, but connected them, carrying armies, goods, and ambitions across waters. Colonial rivalries were no longer side stories to European wars. They were the very front lines of empire. The French and British settlers in North America clashed over fur trading routes and river valleys. Their small fights were like sparks against dry wood. Across the Atlantic, in the busy cities of London and Paris, newspapers warned of foreign plots, stirring fears that national honor was under threat. Ordinary people felt this tension too. In Europe's cities, taxes rose to pay for armies that were never sent home. In colonies, farmers and merchants looked nervously at their borders, where forts flew foreign flags, and native allies could quickly become enemies. In villages, families told stories of past wars, of villages burned and fields ruined, and wondered when the next storm would break. It was as though the world was waiting for a single shot to be fired, a shot that would echo from forests to palaces, from oceans to deserts. And in the Ohio Valley of North America, that shot was about to be fired. The valley was no ordinary stretch of wilderness. It was a gateway. Whoever controlled its rivers and forests controlled trade, controlled the expansion of colonies, and controlled the future of the continent. France built forts to anchor its presence there, linking Canada to Louisiana in a chain of military power. Britain, with its expanding colonies, saw this as a challenge that could not be ignored. And caught between these ambitions were the native tribes who watched European powers carve up lands that belonged to neither Britain nor France. Some tribes chose alliance, others resisted, but all knew the valley would become a battlefield. It is here, in this contested land, that a young Virginia officer would stumble into history. His name was George Washington. At 22, he could not have imagined that his decisions, rash and inexperienced as they were, would unleash a war that would spread across 5 continents. In the shadows before war, Europe's kings and ministers may have believed they controlled the board, but the first move was about to be made not in Vienna, Paris, or London, but in the rugged woods of America. And once made, there would be no turning back. On a damp July evening in 1754, a young lieutenant colonel named George Washington sat inside a crude wooden fort, nervously holding the surrender document thrust into his hands. The fort was poorly built, placed foolishly at the bottom of a valley where rain pooled and the surrounding hills gave the enemy every advantage. It was called Fort Necessity, and it would live up to its name, for Washington had no choice but to accept humiliation. He could not read French, yet he signed the paper anyway. What he did not realize was that he had just confessed in writing to the murder of a French officer, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. Weeks earlier, Washington and his men had ambushed a small French group in the woods of the Ohio Valley. The fight was quick, brutal, and chaotic. Amid the musket fire, Jumonville fell. To the French, it was cold-blooded murder, a crime that demanded revenge. To Washington, it had seemed a necessary act of war. Yet now, he found himself cornered, surrounded by French and native forces far stronger than his ragtag militia. As the ink dried on his surrender, he did not yet know that his actions had lit the fuse of a global fire. At dawn on July 4th, Washington and his beaten men marched away from Fort Necessity, their drums silent, their faces downcast, their weapons muddy, and their pride broken. For Washington, it was the first and only surrender of his career. Yet, in a letter to his brother, he wrote of the strange thrill of hearing bullets whistle past his ears, confessing that there was something charming in the sound. Those words reveal a young officer, not yet humbled by war, but rather excited by its dangerous appeal. He would remember this humiliation, but he would also remember the thrill, a taste of destiny. For Britain, the surrender was an embarrassment. For France, it was an outrage. And for the native tribes of the Ohio Valley, it was a signal. The forest had chosen sides. In those days, alliances with native nations often decided the outcome of colonial wars. The French, who traded furs and respected native ways, were favored by many tribes, such as the Ojibwe, Ottawa, Shawnee, Delaware, and Huron. Others, such as the Iroquois Confederacy, leaned toward the British, though not without suspicion. Every campfire council, every exchange of wampum belts carried the weight of life-and-death decisions for tribes caught between empires. But the Ohio Valley was more than alliances and skirmishes. It was a stage upon which the great European powers would test their ambitions. For centuries, European wars had played out on continental battlefields, Flanders, Silesia, the Rhine. But now, the wilderness of North America had become just as important. Rivers like the Ohio and Mississippi were lifelines of trade and expansion. Whoever controlled them would control the continent's future. The death of one French officer in a distant forest had suddenly become a matter of honor for kings in Paris and London. Washington returned home a defeated soldier, but he was far from finished. His failure had caught the attention of British commanders who believed they could teach the young Virginian how war was truly waged. If Washington's skirmish was the spark, then Britain's next move would be the attempt to strike back with overwhelming force. In the spring of 1755, General Edward Braddock, an aging but proud officer of the Crown, set out with 2,000 men, determined to march into the Ohio Valley and drive the French from their fort at Duquesne. He carried with him the arrogance of the British Empire, certain that disciplined redcoats would make short work of French irregulars and their native allies. What awaited him in the forests of Pennsylvania would shatter that illusion. The summer sun beat down on the long red column of British soldiers as they marched into the wilderness of Pennsylvania in July 1755. General Edward Braddock, dressed in full ceremonial uniform, sat astride his horse, radiating confidence. His force was immense by colonial standards, more than 2,000 men, a mix of British regulars and colonial militia, hauling artillery and supplies along a freshly cut road carved into the dense forest. To Braddock, this was civilization imposing order on chaos. To his enemies, it was an opportunity. Braddock's target was Fort Duquesne, a French stronghold built at the meeting of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, the very heart of the contested Ohio Valley. The French garrison inside numbered only a few hundred, but they were not alone. Their native allies, skilled in guerrilla tactics and intimately familiar with the land, watched Braddock's column advance with predatory patience. For weeks, French scouts and native warriors studied the British movements, waiting for the moment to strike. On the morning of July 9th, as Braddock's men crossed the Monongahela River in disciplined ranks, the forest erupted. From the tree line came a storm of musket fire, the war cries of warriors echoing through the woods. Invisible enemies struck from every direction, darting between trees, firing, then vanishing like shadows. The British line, trained for open-field battles in Europe, was thrown into chaos. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, perfect targets in the dense woods. Panic spread as volleys tore through the ranks. Braddock, shocked by the ferocity of the ambush, refused to adapt. He shouted for his men to hold formation, to fight as though they were on the fields of Flanders, not the forests of America. Officers fell one by one, struck down as they tried to rally the men. Horses screamed, wagons overturned, cannons stuck in the mud. Smoke and fear choked the air. Within hours, nearly 1,000 British soldiers were dead or dying, half the force annihilated. Braddock himself was mortally wounded, carried from the field with a bullet lodged in his chest. And yet, amidst the disaster, one figure stood out. The young George Washington, serving as Braddock's aide, rode fearlessly through the carnage. Bullets ripped his coat. 2 horses were shot from beneath him, yet he survived unscathed. He carried Braddock's final orders, helped organize the retreat, and earned a reputation for courage under fire. Though the battle was a catastrophe, it was also the forge that tempered Washington's character, planting seeds that would grow into the leader of a revolution years later. For the French and their native allies, the victory was overwhelming. It was proof that European armies, with their bright uniforms and rigid discipline, could be broken in the wilderness by those who knew the land. For the British colonies, it was a bitter humiliation, a reminder that the empire's strength was not invincible. And for the native nations who fought that day, it was confirmation that they still held power, still had the ability to shape the fate of their lands, even as foreign empires clashed around them. News of the disaster spread quickly across the colonies and back to Europe. In London, ministers were stunned. How could the world's most powerful empire suffer such a defeat at the hands of a few hundred French soldiers and their native allies? But in taverns and farmhouses across the colonies, the story of Braddock's defeat became legend, a cautionary tale of arrogance undone by the forest itself. The trees had swallowed an army, and with it, the illusion of easy victory. Yet the war was far from over. If Britain had been humiliated on the battlefield, it would soon show its ruthless determination elsewhere. In the far north, the empire turned its attention to Nova Scotia, where a quieter but equally brutal campaign was about to unfold, not against soldiers, but against civilians. Far from the forests of Pennsylvania, another conflict was unfolding in the marshes and tidal rivers of Nova Scotia. Here, the war would not be defined by armies clashing in open combat, but by the fate of ordinary families caught in the struggle between empires. On June 16, 1755, Massachusetts militia under Lieutenant Colonel Robert Monckton crossed the Missaguash River into French-held territory. Their target was Fort Beausejour, a wooden French outpost perched on the border of Acadia. The fort was small and undermanned, but it symbolized France's presence in the region. After a brief siege, Monckton's men captured it, forcing the French defenders to surrender. For the British, it was a simple military victory. But what followed would become one of the darkest episodes in early modern history. The British government, fearful of rebellion, ordered the removal of the French-speaking Catholic settlers of Acadia, men, women, and children who had lived in the region for generations. These Acadians had worked the fertile marshlands, built dikes to tame the tides, and raised their families in relative peace. Many of them had sworn neutrality in the conflict, wishing only to be left alone. But neutrality was not enough for the British authorities, who saw them as a security risk. That summer, soldiers marched into Acadian villages. Families were gathered under guard, their homes and barns set aflame. Over 11,000 people were forced onto ships, torn from their land and scattered across the Atlantic world. Some were sent to the American colonies, where they faced hostility and poverty. Others were deported to France, a homeland they had never seen. Many perished at sea, victims of disease and shipwreck. Historians would later call this Le Grand Derangement, the Great Upheaval. It was, in the words of one scholar, possibly the first time in modern history that a civilian population was forcibly removed as a security risk. For the Acadians, it was an apocalypse. Villages that had stood for a century were reduced to ashes. Families were split apart, never to reunite. Songs and oral traditions kept alive their grief, carrying memories of lost homelands down through generations. In time, some survivors would find refuge in Louisiana, where their descendants became known as Cajuns. But for those who lived through it, the deportation was not a migration. It was an exile imposed by a distant empire that saw them as pawns to be removed from the board. News of the deportation spread, and with it came whispers of British ruthlessness. If the empire could do this to peaceful farmers in Nova Scotia, what might it do elsewhere? For the French, it was a rallying cry, proof that their enemies would stop at nothing. For the natives of the Northeast, it was another reminder that European wars could devastate not only soldiers but entire peoples. The frontier was no longer a borderland of uncertain loyalties. It had become a place where civilians were as vulnerable as armies. And as the flames of Acadian homes lit the night sky, events in Europe were already accelerating towards something far greater. What had begun as colonial skirmishes was about to draw in the crowns of Europe themselves. The struggle for the Ohio Valley and the deportation of farmers in Acadia were not isolated stories. They were the opening chords of a symphony of war that would soon echo across the entire world. The following year, the storm broke. In 1756, France and Britain finally declared war, dragging their allies into the struggle. In Vienna, Paris, London, and Berlin, kings and diplomats aligned their pawns and knights on the chessboard of Europe. Frederick the Great of Prussia struck first, invading Saxony to secure his flank. It was the beginning of a continental clash that would merge with the colonial struggle and turn into something unprecedented, a true world war. By 1756, the fires that had begun in the wilderness of North America spread unstoppably to the courts and capitals of Europe. For 2 years, Britain and France had fought proxy battles through their colonies, avoiding a formal declaration. But this restraint could not last. When French troops captured the British Fort St. Philip on Minorca in June, the illusion of peace collapsed. War was officially declared. The conflict in the New World was now only one front in a storm that threatened to engulf the old. The true shock of 1756 was not the outbreak of war, but the realignment of alliances that accompanied it, a seismic event known as the Diplomatic Revolution. For generations, Austria and France had been bitter enemies, their rivalry defining much of European politics. Yet now, under the shrewd maneuvering of Austrian diplomat Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz, these historic foes joined hands. France allied itself with Austria and Russia, uniting against the threat posed by an ambitious Prussia. Prussia, under Frederick II, had risen swiftly from a minor kingdom to a feared military power. His conquest of Silesia from Austria in the War of Austrian Succession had proven his skill as a commander and earned him the lasting hatred of Empress Maria Theresa. Frederick knew Austria longed to take back what it had lost, and he feared being encircled by Austria to the south, Russia to the east, and France to the west. To survive, he turned to Britain. In the Convention of Westminster, the two powers formed an unlikely alliance. Britain would guard Hanover, its German possession, while Prussia carried the fight on land. The stage was set for a conflict that mirrored in eerie fashion the alliances of a later war nearly 2 centuries away. Britain and Prussia stood against France, Austria, and Russia, a tangled web of powers convinced that one decisive strike could secure their dominance. Each nation entered the war not only with soldiers and cannons but with centuries of resentment and ambition. Frederick, never one to wait for his enemies to act, struck first. In August 1756, he invaded Saxony, a small but strategic state within the Holy Roman Empire. His goal was simple: to secure its army and treasury before Austria could use them. The Saxons resisted fiercely at Dresden and Pirna, but they were outmatched. By October, their king surrendered, and their soldiers were forcibly conscripted into Frederick's ranks. It was a ruthless move, calculated to give Prussia the strength it needed to face the storm. But the price was high. The invasion alarmed Europe, confirming Frederick's reputation as an opportunistic aggressor. By winter, Austrian forces had marched into Silesia, reclaiming its southern portion. Frederick's gamble had secured Saxony, but it had also hardened the resolve of his enemies. The war in Europe was no longer a possibility. It was reality, and while armies clashed in Saxony and Silesia, the rest of the world braced for the conflict to spread further. Britain's navy prowled the seas, seizing French merchant ships. In Bengal, French and British trading companies prepared for open war. In the Caribbean, whispers of raids and blockades filled the ports. The 7 Years' War was no longer confined to the forests of North America. It had become a global struggle for supremacy. For Frederick the Great, the first year of European war was a warning. He had struck boldly, but his enemies were many, and they would not forgive easily. As the snows of winter settled over Saxony, the Prussian king prepared for battles that would test the very limits of his genius. Across Europe, drums beat and soldiers marched. Across oceans, ships raised anchor. The world was moving toward a scale of conflict it had never known before. And far to the east, in the subcontinent of India, the first sparks of another theater were already burning. While muskets cracked in the forests of North America and drums thundered across the plains of Saxony, another theater stirred thousands of miles away: India. Here, the war did not begin with kings or grand alliances, but with merchants. The British and French East India Companies, trading corporations that commanded their own private armies, were locked in a struggle to dominate a subcontinent where the Mughal Empire was a fading giant and local rulers balanced between European powers with wary pragmatism. In the summer of 1756, the spark was struck in Bengal. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, suspicious of British fortifications near Calcutta, attacked the city and forced the British garrison to surrender. What followed would become infamous: the Black Hole of Calcutta. Dozens of British prisoners, perhaps more than 100, were crammed overnight into a stifling dungeon built for far fewer. By dawn, only a fraction were alive. Whether the numbers were exaggerated later by British propaganda or not, the story electrified London, inflaming public outrage and demanding revenge. That revenge came swiftly, carried on the ambitions of a man whose name would become synonymous with Britain's conquest of India: Robert Clive, a soldier of fortune turned company commander. Clive sailed into Bengal with reinforcements and began rallying local allies. By June 1757, his small force of around 3,000 faced an Indian army nearly 50,000 strong at the Battle of Plassey. The odds seemed hopeless, yet fate intervened. On the morning of battle, heavy monsoon rains drenched the fields. The Bengal army's gunpowder was ruined, their cannons silenced. The British, having carefully covered their powder stores, emerged unscathed. When Clive ordered his artillery to open fire, the thunder of British cannon tore through enemy ranks. Adding to the chaos, several of the Nawab's commanders betrayed him, holding back their troops or outright defecting. By day's end, the massive army melted away. Victory belonged to Clive and the East India Company. Plassey was more than a battle. It was a turning point. With a single stroke, the British gained control of Bengal, the wealthiest province in India. Its resources, grain, textiles, and taxes, would fuel Britain's empire for generations. The French, who had aligned with the Nawab, were humiliated. Their influence in Bengal was shattered. For the Indian princes who watched, the message was unmistakable. Alliances with Europeans were treacherous, and fortune favored the British. But the battle's impact was not measured only in politics or wealth. It reshaped lives on the ground. In villages across Bengal, peasants and artisans suddenly found themselves under new masters, corporate officials and merchants who ruled in the name of profit rather than kingship. Taxes rose, trade patterns shifted, and the rhythms of life bent toward the demands of empire. In the bazaars, whispers spread of British ruthlessness, while in London, Robert Clive returned a hero, hailed as the man who had won India for Britain. Plassey did not end the struggle in India. The French still held influence in the south, where the Third Carnatic War raged between rival trading companies. Skirmishes in the countryside and sieges of forts dragged on, with local rulers shifting their loyalties depending on which side offered more gold or security. Yet the momentum had shifted decisively. The British, backed by their navy and the wealth of Bengal, would dominate the subcontinent's future. As cannons fell silent at Plassey, news of Frederick the Great's battles in Europe filtered eastward. To the merchants and soldiers in India, these distant struggles were part of the same storm. Ships that carried silk and spices also carried orders from London and Paris, binding India's fate to the broader war. For the first time, conflicts in the fields of Bengal, the forests of America, and the plains of Saxony were connected threads in a single global tapestry. And in Europe, Frederick was already facing a nightmare of his own. Having gambled boldly in Saxony, he now found himself surrounded. Austria, France, and Russia marching against him. If Plassey marked the rise of Britain, the next battles in Central Europe would test whether Prussia could even survive. The year 1757 opened with Frederick the Great standing at the head of a kingdom encircled. Austria, France, and Russia had bound themselves together, their armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Sweden, too, smelled opportunity and joined the coalition. For a state as small as Prussia, hemmed in by enemies on every border, the situation was dire. Frederick himself admitted in private that he was fighting for his very survival. "We are fighting not for glory but to keep from being annihilated." Yet Frederick was no ordinary monarch. He was a soldier king who lived for the battlefield, a man who believed wars were won not by size but by speed, precision, and nerve. As spring thawed the snows of Saxony and Silesia, he marched his troops with ruthless efficiency, determined to strike first before his enemies could fully coordinate their overwhelming strength. In May, he moved into Bohemia, clashing with Austrian forces near Prague. At first, victory seemed within his grasp. The Prussian army, drilled into perfection with the famed oblique order of attack, pushed the Austrians back and encircled them inside the city. But Frederick's triumph proved fragile. At the Battle of Kolin in June, Austrian General Leopold von Daun struck back. The Prussians, exhausted and overextended, suffered a bitter defeat. For the first time, Frederick tasted the bitterness of being driven from the field, forced into retreat. Still, retreat did not mean defeat. By autumn, Frederick gambled again, this time against the French. At the Battle of Rossbach in November, his army of barely 20,000 faced a Franco-imperial force twice its size. Using speed and deception, Frederick lured the enemy into a trap. His cavalry thundered into their flank while his infantry held firm. Within hours, the French army collapsed in panic, losing thousands, while the Prussians suffered only a few hundred casualties. Europe was stunned. The Great Bourbon Army had been humiliated by a king whose state was scarcely more than a strip of land on the map. If Rossbach was dazzling, the victory at Leuthen a month later was masterful. Facing 80,000 Austrians with only 36,000 men, Frederick maneuvered with astonishing precision. He feigned attacks to pin the enemy, then swung his entire force like a door on a hinge, crashing into the Austrian flank. The result was devastating. The Austrian line crumbled, thousands were captured, and Silesia was saved. For now. Frederick would later call Leuthen his greatest achievement, a battle where skill triumphed over numbers in a way that secured his legend. Yet even as he celebrated, Frederick knew the war was grinding him down. For every Rossbach or Leuthen, there was a Kolin, a reminder that his kingdom's resources were finite. Every casualty bled Prussia dry, while his enemies could replenish endlessly from vast empires. In Berlin, families mourned sons who would not return. Fields went untilled as peasants were conscripted into the army. The state itself bent under the strain of survival. And still Frederick marched. His enemies called him reckless, but his soldiers saw in him a relentless will to fight on, even when surrounded by despair. His very presence on the battlefield seemed to stiffen their resolve. He would ride at the front lines, his uniform powdered with dust, his sword drawn, daring fate to take him. More than once, he nearly did not return. As 1757 drew to a close, Prussia was bloodied but unbroken. Against all odds, Frederick had held back the tide, proving that brilliance could buy time, even when destiny seemed written against him. But time was all he had gained. The coalition still pressed in, and the war was far from over. Meanwhile, in London, a different kind of genius was shaping the struggle. William Pitt, Britain's fiery statesman, looked beyond the smoke of Europe's battlefields. He believed that the war could not be won merely by saving Prussia. It had to be won by striking globally wherever France was weakest. A new vision was taking shape, one that would transform a European conflict into something far greater, a war for the world itself. By the summer of 1757, Britain was reeling. Its armies in North America had been humiliated. Its allies in Europe teetered on the edge of collapse, and its people were beginning to doubt the empire's strength. But then, into the chaos stepped a man whose name would forever reshape Britain's destiny: William Pitt the Elder. Pitt was no ordinary politician. Charismatic, fiery, and relentless, he believed that Britain was not merely a European power but a global one. He had little faith in pouring soldiers into continental battlefields where France and Austria held the advantage. Instead, he saw Britain's true strength in its navy, an armada capable of reaching every corner of the globe. If France could be forced to fight everywhere at once, in the Caribbean, in Africa, in India, and in North America, its resources would stretch thin and its empire would crumble. Europe, he believed, was only one theater of a much larger war. Pitt's strategy was twofold. First, he committed to supporting Prussia with money and supplies, ensuring that Frederick the Great could continue tying down French and Austrian armies on the continent. This was cheaper and far more effective than sending Britain's own soldiers into endless European battles. Second, he unleashed Britain's naval power, transforming the Royal Navy into the hammer of empire. Ships patrolled the Atlantic, raided French ports, and hunted down convoys laden with sugar, furs, and treasure. Every captured merchant ship was both a blow to France's wealth and a prize for Britain's sailors. The results were immediate. In 1758, British squadrons struck at Louisbourg, the French fortress guarding the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. Cannon fire thundered against its walls, and after weeks of bombardment, the fortress fell. This capture opened the gateway to Canada and set the stage for the campaign against Quebec. Across the Atlantic, Britain's flag now flew over strategic islands in the Caribbean, each one a jewel of sugar wealth pried from France's grip. Pitt's vision extended even farther. In Africa, British expeditions targeted French trading posts, undermining their role in the Atlantic slave trade. In India, Robert Clive's victories were reinforced with British ships, tightening the noose on French possessions. Even Spain, though not yet in the war, watched nervously, aware that Britain's reach now threatened its colonies too. For the first time, a European conflict was not just about borders and dynasties. It was about oceans, continents, and empires. But Pitt's brilliance lay not only in strategy but in persuasion. He spoke to Parliament with passion, calling the war not just a matter of kings but of the nation itself. He told Britons that they were fighting for global supremacy, that the fate of their children depended on the navy ruling the seas. His words electrified a people weary of defeats, giving them a vision of victory that reached far beyond Europe's battlefields. And yet, victory came at a cost. Taxes soared, ships were stretched thin, and soldiers died in distant lands many Britons would never see. Critics accused Pitt of gambling Britain's fortune on a war too vast to win. But he never wavered. To him, the 7 Years' War was not simply another dynastic struggle. It was the war that would decide which empire would dominate the world. By 1758, the tide was beginning to turn. Britain, once on the defensive, was seizing the initiative everywhere but in Europe, where Frederick still fought desperately for survival. North America, in particular, became the proving ground for Pitt's strategy. The British had suffered defeat after defeat, but now, with resources flowing and morale rising, they prepared for a renewed offensive. And in the forests of the New World, where the war had first erupted, the clash between Britain and France was about to reach a fever pitch. The year 1758 dawned with Britain determined to erase its humiliations in North America. For 3 years, French forts and their native allies had outmaneuvered redcoats and colonial militia, striking with terrifying precision in forests that swallowed entire armies. But now, with William Pitt's strategy funneling resources into the colonies, Britain was ready to strike back. The vast frontier that had once seemed to belong to France would soon tremble beneath the weight of a resurgent empire. The first great blow came in the north. Louisbourg, the mighty fortress that guarded the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, had fallen the year before. Its loss meant that French Canada could no longer count on the Atlantic for secure supplies. British ships prowled the seas, their cannon muzzles glinting like watchful eyes, daring French convoys to challenge them. The gateway to Quebec and Montreal was opening, and the French knew it. Further south, the struggle centered on Fort Duquesne, the same stronghold that had witnessed Washington's humiliation and Braddock's bloody defeat. For years, Duquesne had been a thorn in Britain's side, projecting French power deep into the Ohio Valley and inspiring native raids on frontier settlements. In November 1758, a massive British force marched westward, nearly 6,000 strong, dwarfing anything sent before. The French, unable to match such numbers, abandoned the fort, burning it as they fled. From its ashes rose Fort Pitt, named for the man who had masterminded Britain's global strategy. Today, that site is downtown Pittsburgh. At last, the frontier spark that had ignited the war was in British hands. But it was not only military victories that shifted momentum. Native alliances, once the cornerstone of French success, began to fracture. The Shawnee and Delaware, weary of endless war and sensing Britain's growing dominance, made peace with the Empire in 1758. Others, like the Iroquois Confederacy, had long been courted by the British and now leaned more firmly in their direction. For France, this was devastating. Without the warriors who knew the land and its ways, French armies in Canada were increasingly isolated. For native peoples, however, these choices carried unbearable weight. Some tribes hoped Britain's promises of protection would mean survival. Others feared, rightly, that once France was gone, the British would no longer need allies. The summer of 1758 also saw Britain strike in the heart of French Canada at Fort Carillon, known later as Ticonderoga. There, in July, a force of 16,000 British regulars and colonial militia hurled themselves against barely 4,000 French defenders. Yet numbers alone did not decide the day. Behind hastily built defenses of logs and earth, the French repelled wave after wave of assaults. The British lost nearly 2,000 men in a single day, one of their bloodiest defeats of the war. But unlike earlier failures, this was not the end of the campaign. The British regrouped, strengthened their supply lines, and vowed to return. The difference now was clear. Defeat no longer meant retreat, but renewal. Across the colonies, the tide of war changed daily life. Farmers, once plagued by raids, began to see safer frontiers. Merchants found new opportunities as British ships secured trade routes. But the cost was steep. Taxes rose to fund the war, and colonial legislatures argued bitterly with royal governors about supplies, recruits, and money. For ordinary settlers, the war remained a grim weight. Sons marching to distant forts, villages mourning those who never came home. Victory was not yet secure, but for the first time it seemed possible. By the year's end, Britain's grip on North America had tightened. Fortresses fell, alliances shifted, and morale soared. Yet the war was not confined to one continent. Even as redcoats secured the Ohio Valley, Frederick the Great in Europe was locked in desperate battles against enemies on all sides. His victories at Rossbach and Leuthen had been dazzling, but his kingdom was still under siege. The fate of the Anglo-Prussian alliance hung in the balance. And so the question loomed, Could Frederick continue to hold the line in Europe long enough for Britain's global victories to turn the war irreversibly in their favor? The answer would be written in blood on Europe's battlefields. While Britain celebrated victories in North America, the continent of Europe drowned in blood. For Frederick the Great, 1758 was a year of unrelenting strain, a year in which his brilliance as a commander was tested against the sheer weight of numbers that threatened to crush Prussia from every side. The enemies were relentless. Austria pressed from the south, determined to reclaim Silesia. Russia advanced from the east, its armies vast but lumbering. France harassed from the west, while Sweden lingered like a wolf circling for scraps in Pomerania. Frederick's kingdom, no larger than modern-day Poland's provinces, stood alone, its population drained, its treasury emptied, its fields stripped bare to feed soldiers. Yet Frederick refused despair. With only 150,000 men under arms, he prepared to fight nations that could field 10 times that number. In January, Russian troops stormed into East Prussia, seizing Königsberg and sending shockwaves through Frederick's court. Though his generals urged caution, Frederick countered boldly. That August, he struck the Russians at Zorndorf. It was a brutal clash, 36,000 Prussians against 43,000 Russians. The fields near Zorndorf ran red with blood as both sides unleashed volleys and bayonet charges. Villagers who returned afterward found corpses stacked like cordwood, horses wandering among the dead. Neither side claimed a decisive victory, but Frederick had achieved what he needed. He had stopped the Russian advance, at least for a time. But the relief was short-lived. In October, the Austrians struck at Hochkirch in Saxony. Frederick, confident and dismissive of warnings, allowed his army to camp vulnerably near the village church. At dawn, 80,000 Austrian troops fell upon his 30,000 men. Cannon fire shattered the stillness, and Austrian infantry poured into the sleeping camp. The Prussians fought with desperate valor, Frederick himself narrowly escaping capture, but the result was disastrous. More than 9,000 Prussians were killed or captured. The defeat was a bitter reminder that even genius could falter against overwhelming force and Frederick's own arrogance. Europe watched with fascination. To Frederick's enemies, he was a menace to be destroyed. To others, he was a miracle of defiance, a David against a coalition of Goliaths. Voltaire, once his friend, described him as a man who fights like Caesar but lives like a philosopher. His soldiers saw something more immediate, a king who shared their hunger and their danger. Frederick rode with them, fought beside them, and demanded from himself the same iron endurance he demanded from his army. In a time when most monarchs directed battles from gilded tents, Frederick bled in the dust alongside his men. But bravery could not alter reality. Prussia was exhausted. Entire villages were empty of young men. The land groaned under requisition. The treasury was hollow. Every victory seemed only to buy another month, another season of survival. And his enemies knew it. Austria, Russia, France, and Sweden believed that time itself would finish Frederick, that eventually his small state would collapse under the sheer weight of attrition. And yet, somehow, Frederick endured. Even after Hochkirch, he refused to retreat into despair. He regrouped, raised new levies, and vowed to fight again. His kingdom stood battered but unbroken, a candle flickering against the winds of empire. Meanwhile, in the forests of Canada, the British prepared for their boldest stroke yet. The fall of Fort Duquesne had opened the Ohio Valley, but the true prize lay farther north. General James Wolfe and his redcoats were marching toward Quebec, the heart of New France. There, on the cliffs above the St. Lawrence, the fate of an entire continent would soon be decided. The summer of 1759 brought Britain and France to a decisive moment in North America. With Louisbourg captured and Fort Duquesne renamed Fort Pitt, the British set their eyes on Quebec, the citadel of New France, perched high upon cliffs overlooking the St. Lawrence River. Whoever controlled Quebec would control Canada itself. For the French, it was a last stand. For the British, it was the key to an empire. Command of the expedition fell to General James Wolfe, a young officer whose sharp mind was matched by a frail body. Plagued by illness, often racked with fever, Wolfe drove himself mercilessly, determined to etch his name into history. Facing him was the seasoned French commander Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, a man of honor who understood the stakes. If Quebec fell, New France was lost. Between them lay the St. Lawrence River, guarded by French batteries and steep cliffs that seemed to promise safety. To assault Quebec directly was madness. But Wolfe was willing to gamble everything. For weeks that summer, Wolfe's army bombarded the city. Shells set homes aflame, reducing entire districts to rubble. The French held firm, their militia and native allies harassing British camps, their morale bolstered by the city's mighty defenses. Wolfe grew restless. His first attempts at direct assault failed. His men cut down in bloody skirmishes. Desperate, he penned a letter to his superiors, admitting that he might fail. And in private, he wrote poetry tinged with the melancholy of a man who knew his time was short. The paths of glory, he mused, lead but to the grave. Then, in September, Wolfe chose a daring plan. Under cover of night, British boats silently drifted along the St. Lawrence, carrying men to a narrow cove just beyond the city. Scaling the cliffs in darkness, soldiers pulled themselves hand over hand, muskets strapped to their backs, their boots scraping against rock. By dawn on September 13th, Wolfe's army stood upon the Plains of Abraham, a wide, open field just outside Quebec's walls. It was a place Montcalm had not expected to fight, and suddenly the British were there in force. The battle that followed was short, sharp, and decisive. Montcalm rushed his men to the field, his lines forming hastily. British muskets, drilled to perfection, unleashed volley after volley, their shots tearing through French ranks. Within minutes, the French line wavered, then broke. Wolfe, at the head of his troops, was struck by musket fire. Carried to the rear, bleeding from 3 wounds, he lived just long enough to hear the cry, "They run!" Smiling faintly, he whispered, "Now God be praised. I die in peace." Montcalm, too, was mortally wounded. Taken back into the city, he was told he would not survive the night. "So much the better," he replied. "I shall not live to see Quebec surrendered." And by the next day, the city did surrender. The twin deaths of Wolfe and Montcalm, 2 commanders who had fought with valor, became the tragic poetry of the war, the fall of New France written in the blood of both its defenders and conquerors. For Britain, Quebec's capture was monumental. It meant Canada was all but theirs, though skirmishes and campaigns would continue. For France, it was catastrophe. A colony that had taken generations to build was crumbling in a single season. And for the native peoples who had fought alongside France, it was a turning point they dreaded. With the French gone, they would soon face the British alone. In London, church bells rang in triumph. In Paris, silence fell, broken only by the mutterings of statesmen who knew their empire was slipping away. Yet even as the St. Lawrence fell silent under British rule, the war in Europe raged on. Frederick the Great, battered but unbowed, was preparing to meet his enemies yet again. And on the seas, Britain's navy struck blow after blow, ensuring that wherever France turned, it found only defeat. By the close of 1759, Britain had proven its dominance not only in North America but upon the seas themselves. The Royal Navy, sharpened by Pitt's vision, became the empire's sword and shield, slicing through French commerce and strangling their colonies. Naval victories did not merely protect Britain. They transformed the war. That August, off the coast of Portugal, the British fleet under Admiral Boscawen shattered the French at the Battle of Lagos. 2 months later, at Quiberon Bay, Admiral Edward Hawke braved storm and shoal to destroy the French fleet in one of the most daring naval clashes of the century. In pounding rain and towering waves, British warships hurled themselves into combat among dangerous shores where a single misstep meant wreckage. The French line disintegrated, their ships driven onto rocks or captured. France's dream of invading Britain was gone forever. From that moment on, the English Channel belonged to London. The seas became Britain's highway of empire. Sugar islands in the Caribbean fell into their grasp. Guadeloupe, Martinique, Dominica, each one more valuable than gold. In an age where sugar was a currency of power, French merchants watched in despair as their ships were captured by the hundreds, their fortunes evaporating. Britain was not merely winning battles. It was dismantling France's ability to fight at all. Meanwhile, in India, the struggle that had begun at Plassey reached its climax. The British East India Company, now flush with Bengal's wealth, pressed its advantage. At Wandiwash in 1760, British forces under Sir Eyre Coote clashed with the French army commanded by General Thomas Lally. Outnumbered and outgunned, the French held bravely, but the tide of fortune had turned. The disciplined volleys of British sepoys and redcoats broke their lines. French cavalry charges faltered against British artillery. By day's end, Lally's army was shattered. The fall of Wandiwash left the French clinging desperately to Pondicherry, their last major stronghold in India. For months, the British closed in by land and sea. Civilians inside the city starved, their once bustling markets reduced to silence. Disease stalked the streets. When the garrison finally surrendered in January 1761, it was not merely a city lost. It was the death knell of French India. From then on, Britain would dominate the subcontinent, ruling in the name of trade but with the power of empire. The effect of these victories rippled across the globe. In Europe, French ministers despaired, knowing their colonies, the jewels of empire, were being stripped away. In London, Pitt declared that Britain had won the empire on a sea of ink and blood. His words were not boastful. They were prophecy. Britain was emerging not just as a victor in war but as the world's preeminent maritime power. Yet the war was not won everywhere. Even as Britain triumphed abroad, Frederick the Great faced catastrophe at home. His kingdom, surrounded and bleeding, staggered beneath the weight of coalition armies. Victories at Rossbach and Leuthen had proven his genius, but genius alone could not hold back Austria, France, Russia, and Sweden forever. By 1760, Prussia seemed on the verge of collapse. And so, as Britain built an empire upon the oceans, all eyes turned back to Europe, where Frederick fought not for glory but for survival. By 1760, Frederick the Great stood at the edge of ruin. For all his victories, Rossbach, Leuthen, Zorndorf, his enemies had not been destroyed. They had merely bled, regrouped, and returned. Austria pressed harder into Silesia. Russia advanced relentlessly from the east. France struck in the west, while Sweden gnawed at Pomerania. Frederick's small kingdom was besieged by empires. His men were exhausted, his resources drained, his cities trembling at the thought of invasion. That year, disaster came home to Berlin. In October, Russian and Austrian troops marched into the Prussian capital itself. For 3 days, the city was occupied. Soldiers looted stores, demanded ransoms, and paraded in Frederick's streets. The humiliation was staggering. To Europe, it seemed clear. Prussia was finished. Even Voltaire, once Frederick's friend and admirer, wrote that the king had played brilliantly but was now like a candle burning at both ends. Yet Frederick refused to collapse. When word reached him of Berlin's fall, he did not surrender. Instead, he raged, swore vengeance, and vowed to keep fighting. He told his officers, "If I must perish, I will do so with honor, sword in hand." To his weary soldiers, he became a figure of grim determination, a king who would rather march into annihilation than accept defeat. But the cost was terrible. At Torgau in November 1760, Frederick fought one of his bloodiest battles. Facing the Austrians under dawn, he launched repeated assaults up fortified hills. His men charged through grapeshot and musket fire, collapsing in heaps, only to rise and attack again. At last, as dusk fell, Prussian bayonets carried the day. But victory came at the price of 16,000 casualties, nearly a third of his army. The fields were left littered with corpses, mute testimony to a triumph that looked indistinguishable from disaster. The strain on Prussia was unbearable. Villages were emptied of young men, fields left unharvested. Families starved while their sons marched endlessly to battle. Frederick himself grew gaunt, his once sharp features hollowed by exhaustion. He confessed privately that suicide sometimes tempted him, that the burden of command weighed too heavily even for a king. And yet he pressed on, clinging to survival with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. By 1761, the crisis deepened. Russian armies captured Kolberg, Prussia's last Baltic port, cutting Frederick off from British naval support. Austria surged again into Silesia, tightening its grip. The coalition of empires seemed ready to deliver the death blow. Frederick, with fewer than 60,000 soldiers left to his name, faced enemies who outnumbered him nearly 6-1. Europe waited for his collapse. London considered abandoning him, its new king, George III, far less committed to the Prussian alliance than Pitt had been. In Paris and Vienna, ministers spoke of partitioning Prussia, dividing its lands as spoils of war. To many, it seemed the map of Europe was about to be redrawn, with Frederick remembered as a daring commander who had burned brightly before being snuffed out. And then, at the darkest hour, fate intervened. A single death in a distant court would transform the war, turning annihilation into survival. The miracle Frederick had prayed for, against all reason, was about to arrive. In January 1762, as Prussia bled and staggered toward what seemed certain extinction, news swept through Europe like a thunderclap. Empress Elizabeth of Russia was dead. For Frederick, it was nothing less than salvation. Elizabeth had been one of his most implacable enemies, hurling vast Russian armies against his fragile state. But her successor, Peter III, was cut from an entirely different cloth. Peter admired Frederick to the point of obsession. He wore the Prussian uniform, drilled his guards in Prussian style, and spoke of the King of Prussia as though he were a hero to be worshipped rather than an enemy to be destroyed. Almost immediately, Peter ordered a ceasefire. He released occupied Prussian territory, returned captured fortresses, and even sent 20,000 Russian troops to fight under Frederick's command. Europe looked on in disbelief. What had seemed like Prussia's final hour now appeared as a miraculous deliverance. Historians would later call it the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. But the miracle was not perfect. Within months, Peter himself was overthrown in a coup led by his wife, Catherine the Great. The new empress had little love for Frederick and quickly pulled Russia out of the war entirely. Yet even that worked in Frederick's favor. Better neutrality than annihilation. With Sweden also withdrawing from the conflict, Prussia suddenly found itself facing only Austria and France, foes still formidable but no longer an unstoppable tide. Frederick wasted no time. With Russian troops briefly under his banner, he struck at Berkersdorf in Silesia, halting Austrian advances and proving once again that Prussia could not be erased so easily. His enemies, weary after years of attrition, began to lose their appetite for the struggle. Austria's finances collapsed under the strain. France bled treasure overseas, and Britain, though victorious abroad, grew tired of funneling subsidies into the heart of Europe. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a new power entered the conflict. Spain, under Charles III, threw its weight behind France in 1762, hoping to curb Britain's meteoric rise. Yet, instead of shifting the balance, Spain only exposed its empire to British assault. Havana in Cuba and Manila in the Philippines, jewels of Spanish dominion, fell to British fleets. Britain, already triumphant in North America and India, now struck down another empire with brutal efficiency. For Frederick, Spain's entry into the war mattered little. What mattered was that his kingdom had survived the storm. In 1762, Prussia still stood, battered, impoverished, but unbroken. Against every expectation, against every calculation, the small northern state had resisted the combined fury of Europe's greatest powers. It was not victory in the traditional sense, but it was survival. And for Frederick, survival was triumph enough. By the war's final year, exhaustion ruled all sides. Britain and France yearned for peace. Austria could no longer sustain its campaigns, and Frederick, his armies reduced to shadows of their former strength, needed only to endure a little longer. Negotiations were already being whispered in courts from Paris to London. The great storm was breaking, and when the treaties were finally signed in 1763, they would redraw the world. Britain ascendant, France humbled, Prussia preserved. Yet behind those treaties lay a deeper truth. The 7 Years' War had not simply been won or lost. It had remade the world, planting the seeds of revolutions yet to come. By 1763, the guns of the 7 Years' War finally fell silent. What had begun as a skirmish in the Ohio Valley had swollen into a storm spanning 5 continents, draining treasuries, toppling colonies, and leaving millions dead or displaced. It was, in every sense, the first global war. Its ending did not come through one decisive battle but through exhaustion, a collective recognition that even empires could bleed themselves dry. The peace was sealed in 2 great documents. The Treaty of Paris, signed in February 1763, reshaped the colonial map of the world. France surrendered nearly all its territories in North America, ceding Canada to Britain and giving Louisiana west of the Mississippi to Spain. It lost its foothold in India, retaining only small trading posts without military power. Its prized Caribbean islands, though some were returned, were now vulnerable reminders that Britain's navy ruled the seas. Spain, having entered the war late, paid dearly as well, ceding Florida to Britain in exchange for Havana and Manila. Britain emerged with an empire unparalleled in size, straddling the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, its ships commanding global trade routes. In Europe, the Treaty of Hubertusburg brought an uneasy end to the continental struggle. Austria failed to reclaim Silesia, confirming Prussia's rise as a great power. Frederick the Great had not won in the traditional sense, but he had survived against impossible odds. Survival alone elevated Prussia into the ranks of Europe's decisive states, setting the stage for the power struggles that would dominate the 19th century. For the native peoples of North America, however, peace brought no triumph. France's departure left them at the mercy of the British, whose promises of alliance dissolved once victory was secure. Tribes who had fought and bled for their homelands found their lands claimed by settlers and their concerns dismissed by imperial governors. Within a year, Pontiac's rebellion would erupt as native warriors rose against British forts in a desperate bid to resist dispossession. The war's end for Europe's kings was only the beginning of a new struggle for those who lived on the contested frontier. The legacy of the war was profound. Britain's dominance came at the cost of staggering debts it would soon attempt to recover from its American colonies. Taxes and restrictions imposed in the wake of victory would ignite sparks of rebellion across the Atlantic, leading to a revolution that forever altered history. In France, humiliation and debt fed discontent, sowing seeds of anger that would one day erupt into the French Revolution. In Prussia, survival secured its destiny as the nucleus of a future German power. The world had been reordered not by chance but by fire. As the cannons fell silent, the war left behind more than treaties and borders. It left a question: could empires truly control the globe? Or did victory always plant the seeds of its own downfall? On the ashes of Acadian villages, in the silence of Quebec's plains, in the scarred fields of Silesia, that question lingered. The 7 Years' War had ended, but its echoes would shape the revolutions, nations, and empires of centuries to come.